Hi everyone, welcome to week 12. Today we're going to be going over chapter 10, which is covering about 20 years of sport from 1980 to 2000. And so now that we're going into more of the modern era, again, I kind of don't feel as much of a need to go over the general timeline things because either they happened when we were alive or they happened so recently that a lot of us would probably be very familiar with a lot of the things that happened. So really kind of focusing more so on the sports timeline for these next couple of weeks, and in particular going into some of the things that really mark these 20 years as very different because this is kind of considered the globalized era of sport. And so recognizing that this is kind of the end of the Cold War, recognizing that there's still a lot of geopolitical tensions to hash out within the sporting space, but also recognizing that even American sports are becoming very internationalized. So talking about basketball, baseball, football, and really how we see and appraise these different areas of sport in this new modern age. And so this was, again, a time very marked by America, but it's also global expansion. And so I really like kind of how the book talks about this era as being marked by two icons in the sport of basketball. Icons like Michael Jordan and Yao Ming that were both very symbolic of these two decades in America, but for very different reasons. So for MJ, he really represented this idolization of sports heroes on domestic soil as an American, celebrated by Americans. But then for Ming, he represented this idolization of American sports, culture, and language internationally, and as an international athlete being celebrated here on American soil. And so as we've talked about many times in this class, there's always been a back and forth ebb and flow over this acceptance of, one, American culture being accepted internationally, but also international athletes being accepted in America. And so now we're getting to a place where sports are now desegregated, sports are now very liberalized, in the general history of sports. And so now this next kind of platform or this next kind of battleground is acceptance on international spaces. So again, whether American sports are accepted internationally, but also international athletes being accepted in America. And so America really became a globalist icon through corporate imperialism, particularly through sport. And it unfortunately created a lot of international concerns because a lot of people feared a lot of the negative effects of America, or negative impacts of American culture. Many people were concerned that the embrace of American culture and values internationally would eliminate their individual cultures and values. They feared the negative aspects of American culture, of violence, drug abuse, commercialization, greed, plutocracy, challenging patriarchal systems, and more. This was also a time that was marked by the Iran hostage crisis, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the invasion of Grenada and Nicaragua. They were very fresh in global politics as well. And so even though there was kind of this greater cultural acceptance of America on a cultural domain, it wasn't met without its criticisms. We also had a lot of domestic issues as well. There were a lot of controversial presidencies during this time. We're going to talk about the AIDS epidemic today, cocaine and other drug addictions, the wealth gap between Wall Street wolves and impoverished Americans. People were still grieving the Challenger explosion, increased homelessness, and so it caused not only international audiences to question American culture, but it also allowed Americans to question American culture and their government systems. And so to get into kind of some of the reasons why people were very critical of American culture, specifically within the sporting space, was this idea of corporate sport, the idea that the end of the century was very much marked as a time of increased professionalism, commercialization, and globalization, in which, again, kind of going into what we talked about last week, a lot of technological advancements increased access and fandom, as well as money, like cable TV, satellite dishes, and the young internet being kind of very mainstream available at this point. And so these things really contributed to the growth of American sport, both domestically and internationally in many different spaces. And so there's a lot of different programs that were created during this time, one of which is arguably still one of the most popular media outlets today is ESPN. So ESPN was created in 1979, and it was created initially for the young male sports junkie demographic with more of a fraternity house atmosphere, very debaucherous, very tavern culture as things that we've seen before. And it covered pretty much any and everything that they wanted. Initially, they really only covered marginal sports like women's sports, golf, tennis, but eventually had so many spin-offs that they covered any and everything they wanted. So today we have ESPNU, which covers college sports, ESPN Classic, which is kind of reruns of things that have happened during this era of sport or even before. We also have ESPNW, which covers women's sports. So ESPN definitely became a strong presence. It kind of marketed itself as the first 24/7 sports news company just for sports, because again, ABC, CBS, NBC, they had other things outside of just sports. Yes, they made a lot of money off of their sports broadcasting, but they had other things as well. ESPN really kind of established itself very differently because it was made for the purposes of sports. And then we have Disney. So Disney initially, as I'm sure a lot of us are very familiar with, was not a sports enterprise at its inception. In the 1940s and 50s, it really was a movie animation studio by Walt Disney, but it became part of the sporting space because ESPN, as we just talked about, was bought by Disney, really kind of creating a more tamer atmosphere with more mainstream acceptance than the initial kind of background or climate of it being a very kind of debaucherous fraternity culture that it initially was. And so Disney created ESPN into kind of what it is today because they purchased it in 1996. It made it more mainstream. It made it more family friendly. And Disney also created the Anaheim Ducks franchise in 1993, bought ABC in 1995, and controlling share of the Anaheim Angels in 1996. And so this was the time that we started to see a lot more of a monopolization over corporate sport, and particularly like broadcasting sport. A lot of sport organizations kind of proliferated during this time. They started to control their own broadcasting, in which some of the broadcasting markets were still established, still very strong. But we also started to see that sports created their own TV companies like the NFL Network, NBA Preview, the Golf Channel, Fox Soccer Channel, Nickelodeon Games and Sports all kind of came during this time as well. And then wealthy individuals also started to control broadcasting with immense control over their respective sports teams and broadcasting companies. And so Ted Turner was the owner of the Turner Broadcasting System, TBS, and he also owned a majority of the Atlanta Braves. And so not only did he have a very strong influence in the broadcasting of sports, but he also had his own ownership of a team as well. Also happens to be coincidence, not really, but baseball in particular, which is what the Atlanta Braves are, they're a baseball team. TBS actually broadcasts, TNT and TBS also broadcast baseball games today. And so those two things kind of go hand in hand with Ted Turner. We also have Rupert Murdoch, which at the time was the majority owner of the LA Dodgers, Fox Sports Network, 20th Century Fox, and had all MLB and NHL broadcasting. That has now shifted. We have kind of more of a splintering that we see with professional football nowadays. But at the time, the power and opportunity for sports to be broadcast was really kind of afforded to a select few, either by a select few broadcasting networks or by a select few individuals. And so, because even though the power of broadcasting and commercialization, this corporate sport development was really in the hands of a select few, there was still a lot of money to be had in the sporting space. And so we see a lot of developments and changes to the sport, the stadiums that were developed, as well as pay going towards the athletes or from the athletes as a result of this increased corporate kind of business surrounding professional sport. And so there are a lot of changes to sport really due to this increased commercialization, which caused a lot of innovative ways to bring more fans to their respective sports. So some things that happened as a result of this increased commercialization are instant replays. We have more technological access so that we have a lot more camera angles. We have the ability to rerun tape. And so instant replays gave spectators the chance to be their own referees and really engage deeper into the sports that they're watching. We also have new gameplay styles that happened as a result of this increased commercialization. And so I like to bring up the example from the San Francisco 49ers, which during the 80s, 90s, was led by Bill Walsh and quarterback Joe Montana, and they introduced a very new West Coast offense that allowed them to not only bring in fans because it was a new style of how to play football, but it also allowed them to win 4 Super Bowls during the 1980s as a result of this new unique play style, which essentially placed more priority on passing the football as opposed to it just being run down the middle by their running backs, very much prioritized passing ability for quarterbacks, as well as catching ability and running ability for wide receivers, which even now you can make the argument too that quarterbacks today are also expected to be mobile as opposed to being just good slingers. And so you kind of see this now in the conversations around Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, that even today you can make the argument that the new play style for football is a result of not only requiring it to be a faster, more exciting gameplay for the wide receivers, but also for the quarterbacks who play the game. We also have a lot of new stars during this era. An example that I like to bring up is Fernando Valenzuela. Fernando Mania was very much something that was extremely sensationalized during the 1980s for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And not only was he an extremely talented pitcher, but he also kind of, again, was symbolic of a greater movement, particularly for Chicano Americans during a time that was extremely tumultuous, that there's a lot of poor working and living conditions met for this community, and it was met with a variety of movements to enforce humanitarian rights on this community. And so this was a space that sport allowed it to be a greater conversation around equality and equity outside of the sporting space itself. And so a lot of changes to sport, a lot of changes to fandom and how people kind of approach sports. We also see that people, again, kind of continuing our conversation from last week, are recognizing that stadiums can be used for tourism, that owners wanted to find new ways to attract people to watching games live. Because again, not only did we have an extreme accessibility issue with televisions, but also the internet was starting to kind of create this new streaming culture that now is very, very normalized with sports. But people wanted to still have money coming in from watching live sports. And so there's a lot of new ways in which owners utilized stadiums to create this new kind of experience that you could only get from watching sports live. And so for new stadiums, this is where a lot of people, as we've seen, owners would bully local governments to pay for it. And so that cost didn't come at anything from them. For old stadiums, they would capitalize and promote the historical richness of the stadium. And additionally, most of the older stadiums are much smaller. So there's this kind of like implicit exclusivity of going to an in-person game at this kind of smaller venue, which makes it more exciting. Again, like you're a part of a community of people who are able to witness this sport live. Soldier Field, I think, is a really good example of that. Comparatively to a new stadium like SoFi, which is large, that again, you get all the cool aspects of the new stadium. During this time as well, we also see a lot of stadiums selling exclusivity, meaning that they would sell skyboxes, personal seat licenses, and exclusive rights to food, parking, clothes, etc., just to make it more of a exciting experience for people who could afford that type of experience. We also have the creation of naming rights, which are just basically a free way to make money where companies put their names on stadiums. So to give you some examples, Petco Park is where the San Diego Padres play. So Petco is a company, it's a pet company, right? You buy pet food, pet toys, whatever. But they have naming rights over the stadium where the San Diego Padres play. So that's why it's called Petco Park. Another example is Oracle Park, where the San Francisco Giants play. When I was a kid, it was AT&T Park, but before that, it was Coca-Cola Park. So naming rights have been kind of a generational mark as well for people who kind of think of this, where do people play? How old are you? What are the things that you saw when it was named that thing? Another example is Crypto.com Arena, right? I grew up in the era where it was called Staples Center, which even in my head, I still call it Staples Center in downtown LA, which is where the Clippers, when the Clippers would play there, as well as the Lakers, as well as the LA Kings. They also have a lot of other cool things. But essentially, it's just a couple $1 million that you get for free to put your name on the outside of a building. A lot of owners also kind of approach stadiums as pseudo museums in which they would have Hall of Fames, athlete highlights, or other sports memorabilia that were kept at the stadiums and act like museums to showcase the history of the team. So even if you weren't even a fan of the sport itself, you could still be fans of the history. You can still be fans of the legacy. And so that was another way to appeal to another group of folks to come and watch the sports live. And then finally, to acknowledge city tourism, that a lot of these owners would take advantage of their relationships with their home cities. They would get subsidies to make it cheaper to have events at the stadium. They would get assistance in traffic control, as well as having an advantageous geography within a hub of the urban city. And one of my favorite examples of this is Petco Park. If any of you have ever been to downtown San Diego, Petco Park is literally in the middle of the city. And so it not only provides people with an experience to go and travel in downtown, town, go to Gaslamp, go to do whatever, but then you're also, there for a baseball game or a concert or whatever. And so stadiums for tourism very much increased at this time. But all these things to say is that there's a lot more money coming into the sport. So pay became a very contentious thing that happened during this era. As owners were making more money, players also wanted control over their pay and wanted increases too, right? Reasonable. But unfortunately, we found that there were a lot of strikes that happened during this era, that people were not happy with how much they were getting paid as athletes. And so there was a lot of fights that were happening during these 20 years, in particular with the MLB in 1981 and in 1994. Most of the MLB strikes were really for free agency and against salary caps, but unfortunately, as a result of these strikes, they lost significant fandoms. So in 1981, the athletes went on strike mid-season for free agency rights. After 50 days, the owners conceded and granted them negotiation rights to their salaries and contracts of financial compensation. But that didn't last very long, because in 1994, the athletes went on strike again for 234 days, which canceled the World Series that year. They went on to fight against a salary cap that was put in place by the owners. The players won with a ruling from a federal judge. But again, the fan base took a massive hit because people, fans of the sport, thought the owners and the athletes were just being greedy, money grubby. And so kind of acknowledging things that we've seen in many other instances in the history of this class, people didn't really identify with the athletes anymore. These were $1 million people that didn't really appeal to wider working class America. And so people really fell out of fandom with baseball, that even today, they're still kind of struggling to get back. We also have the NFL going on strike in 1982, and they did so for minimum salary rights, and as well as general athlete rights, but no TV or trade control. So to give you some context, in 1982, the athletes went on strike for minimum salary for all athletes, right? They wanted their rookies to get paid just like their veterans. They also wanted to increase athlete rights and negotiation rights during this time of agency of trying to have equal or just fight for better pay. However, as kind of a counterpoint to that, owners still maintain control over TV and player trading rights. And so kind of a compensation of, yes, we can give you more money, but we still control pretty much how that money comes in and how you're able to make more money on other teams. Then for professional basketball with the NBA, they had a strike in 1998. But what happened that led to the strike in 1998 was really interesting. So at the time, the commissioner, David Stern, was very proactive in trying to make sure that the league didn't go on strike. They saw what happened to professional baseball. He saw what happened to professional football. And he said, okay, we're going to try to be proactive and give our athletes stuff before they go on strike and ask for these things. And so what he did is he gave the athletes a 53% income revenue, or he gave athletes a 53% of the incoming revenue, but owners got a salary cap. And so this lasted for a while. So during the 80s and 90s, this was fine enough until 1998. The peace lasted until then, because then the athletes went on lockout for 204 days, resulting in the salary cap for owners, but a rise in minimum salary for the athletes. And so all this to say, there was still a strike in the 1998 that allowed for this kind of compensation to happen. And so because of all of these things happening in domestically, it's important for us to recognize that international competition was becoming extremely competitive and extremely globalized. The Olympics, as we've talked about, has always acted as a pawn in global strike and struggle. We saw many examples of that last week with the Cold War. We also still see the Cold War having its kind of dredges in the international competition during this era as well. In 1980 Winter Olympics, this was held in Lake Placid, New York, and really returned a lot of nationalist pride to the United States. This was a time of Eric Heiden, who was a U.S. speed skater, won 5 gold medals during his reign in this Winter Olympics, as well as this being the Miracle on Ice Olympics that happened, if any of you have ever seen Miracle, the Disney movie, but really kind of talked about how the United States was a team of underdogs, because in this time, all athletes who played for the Olympics had to be amateurs, right? We still always have that moral struggle between amateurism and professionalism. But the athletes that competed in the 1980 Winter Olympics were all college kids. They didn't get paid. They weren't the best athletes because they weren't pros yet. And so we were very much the underdogs going into this space that was, again, marked by a lot of geopolitical tensions, especially against the USSR, which has historically always been a very good hockey team. And so eventually the United States beat the USSR men's hockey team. It was kind of a demonstration of capitalism defeating communism as kind of one of the last examples in which we see this geopolitical tension being hashed out. That being said, in 1980, in the Summer Olympics, a lot of countries actually boycott going to Moscow in the USSR. The United States and 36 other countries boycott participating because of the USSR occupation of Afghanistan. And so they basically recognized that there was a lot of political platform that if they did decide to go to Moscow, they'd be putting money towards their local economies. They'd be more or less supporting those initiatives. And so a lot of capitalist nations refused to go and compete in 1980. But as kind of a consequence to that, in 1984, we held with the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, in which not only did the Eastern Bloc and other Eastern European and USSR nations boycott by not going, this was also the time that we started to see increased commercialization of the Olympics. And so to kind of give you some context about that, the US started to commercialize the events for the first time ever. This was, again, kind of a space where amateurism competition reigned supreme. If there was any and all money that had to be involved, it was kind of taking away from the altruistic kind of perspective of international competition, that it should be about world peace, it should be about sports, it shouldn't be about making money. But the Olympics are very expensive, and so the United States was like, well, why not let us solicit advertisements and sponsorships and endorsements from these companies? And so because the United States commercialized the events for the first time ever, it forever changed the games. Like I said, it caused less financial burden for hosts by getting corporate sponsors. They mechanized a lot of the financial strain on companies. They also started to commercialize their broadcasting rights instead of the government footing the bill. The IOC not only accepted commercialization, but became an ardent proponent. And by 1985, they established their own corporate sponsorships because the US was so good at soliciting commercialization that for the first time ever, we turned a profit from hosting the Olympics, which is why today so many cities vie for the chance to host the Olympics because of this idea that we might be able to make money. It has never happened since 1984, but it is an interesting kind of influence as to why the Olympics are so heavily desired. Additionally, because the United States commercialized the games, they said, well, if all things are fair and equal, if the IOC and the USOPC can elicit sponsorships, why not the athletes? And so after the 1984 Summer Olympics, they eliminated the amateur requirement for athletes competing at the Olympics. The IOC president, Juan Antonio Samaranch, acknowledged athletes had been pro for years, kind of, acknowledging that that countries would subsidize their athletes. They would put their winnings into trusts, so it's not paying them, but it's kind of paying them. So kind of basically being like, we're being hypocrites. Like, let's just take down the veil. Let's allow professional athletes to be professionals, but also be Olympians. And so basically saying he wanted the best of the best to compete, even if they're professional athletes. So the IOC and other national sporting organizations voted and accepted to allow professional athletes to compete at the games starting in 1985. And so that has kind of become the standard, which is why we've had the dream teams. We've had so many athletes go and continue on to be professionals, even if they started as Olympians. And so American sports also had a large international presence as well. So we started to have a lot more of exhibition shows of football and for baseball, in which we have regional business offices in Canada, Mexico, and Japan, where these games are held. Baseball increased in international popularity, particularly in these nations of Japan, Korea, China, Mexico, Canada. But football didn't gain as much traction comparatively. They didn't really find a lot of fandom in Europe. However, in Mexico, Japan, and the Pacific and Caribbean, countries really took to this sport. It was very recognizable to a lot of other very popular sports during the time. And so we started to see this expansion. But overall, not only do we see American sports internationally, but we're also seeing international athletes come and play American sports. And so I like to kind of let that segue into our documentary this week of Back on Board. You're more than welcome to watch the whole thing, but really want you to focus on this kind of section where it talks about Greg Louganis, who's regarded as one of the best divers in the world, sweeping both gold for both diving events in 1984 and 1988. And so just kind of talking about his story, why he's so iconic in this era, and really why he in particular represents and is symbolic of a lot of different struggles and strife that happened during the 1980s as well. So what was the medical diagnosis that Greg received before his 1988 Olympics? How did the public and sports writers talk and think about Greg? How would he be received if he talked openly about being gay? And from not disclosing his medical diagnosis and still competing in the Olympics, do you think what Greg did was right? Do you think athletes need to disclose their medical histories to compete at the Olympics? So let me know if you have any questions about that. But now we're going to get into talking about how we see the growth of American sports on domestic soil for many different reasons. And so for baseball, we start to see the creation of a lot of new rules, which makes it a lot more fun, maybe a lot more recognizable to things that we have today. We have no rules on the playing structure in the playing season. We started to introduce the wild card games during this era, as well as playing in between leagues. So we started to have the National League and the American League play against each other in the regular season, creating regional rivalries. Because again, before this time, the National League and the American League really only played against each other. The only time they came together was for the World Series. That is no longer the case because they recognize that, again, even within thinking about Los Angeles, we have the Los Angeles Dodgers, which is the National League, and the Los Angeles Angels, which are the American League. Why not create regional kind of rivalries and get people in our Los Angeles, greater Los Angeles community to come and watch baseball again? So a lot of new rules happened during this era. We also had a lot of new athletes during this era, like Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire, and Barry Bonds, who, if any of you are familiar with those baseball athletes, were not only extremely talented in the sport that brought a lot of fame, but they also brought a lot of controversy because this was kind of leading into what we call the steroid era of sport, which we're going to talk more about next week when we get into the report that was done by a senator and kind of breaking down the veil of baseball, professional baseball, as being very much adhering to steroid usage. But they not only brought greater fame with their dominance in the sport with the most home runs, record-setting home runs, but also the suspicion and admittance eventually of using performance-enhancing drugs to get those accolades. And so people were kind of fans of the sport for what they were achieving, but not for the moral reasons in which they're doing drugs in order to do so. We also find that, again, the sport of baseball is growing domestically, but also internationally, that there's a lot more international acceptance. We start to have a lot more love for international athletes, specifically from Latin America and the Dominican Republic, where, as we've talked about before, the MLB had already established baseball camps in these communities right after the Spanish-American War. And so we see baseball grow for many different reasons, and we also see basketball growing for different reasons, similar reasons, but also with different people, right? New athletes during the era, we have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan really proved to be the largest driving force in this massive explosion in popularity. And so we're going to get back to him in a second. But I want us to first recognize too that basketball, comparatively to baseball and football, is a relatively young sport. And so they couldn't really kind of take the culture that had already been established by baseball and football and try to make it theirs. They really needed to create something that was different, that set them apart from the long-standing history of football and baseball. And so what they did is that the NBA and kind of the culture of basketball really emphasized individualism, rivalries, race and ethnicity, life before basketball, and statistics. And all these different things were very differentiated from the team-like culture of baseball and football, right? That basketball, you had specific athlete names that you knew. You had specific athletes that would, be a part of a team, which is still arguably how we feel about the sport today, in which it's not about how is a team doing, but how is this individual person doing? Are they getting traded to another team? What is their impact in the sport? And so for this era in particular, the new global icon for the sport of basketball does take in the form of Michael Jordan. He's credited as being the most transformative athlete in basketball at this time. He has innumerable accolades, extremely competitive skill, and raw talent that made him a very idolized athlete that many spectators actually thought of as, quote, Black Jesus. Through his on and off playing with the league, he also acquired a Nike shoe deal, which again, Jordan is arguably one of the most iconic brands in sport in just like shoe wear overall. He also played on minor league baseball teams. He's a part owner of the Washington Wizards while racking up, again, these various highlights and awards with his nearly 2-decade-long career. He and his fellow basketball stars also promoted basketball as well as the capitalist value systems around the world. So again, he kind of became part of the dream team after professional athletes were allowed to be Olympians. And so he kind of became this international icon in addition to being a domestic icon. So these are just some of the accolades that I've pictured here for you all. But to acknowledge that, again, these sports are growing for different reasons, but really capitalizing on names, developing new rules, and just having greater international acceptance. We also see that for women in sport, that despite the absorption of the AIW into the NCAA in 1981, many women athletic stars shined, and the participation of girls and women in sport continued to rise. And a lot of that is really due to the initiatives and kind of the celebration of so many of these dominant women athletes in these professional sporting and Olympic sporting spaces. And so in terms of women's professional basketball, there are many changes and challenges with opening and closures of many different leagues. Like we had the Women's Basketball League that existed from 1979 to 1981, the Women's American Basketball Association that only existed for one season in 1984, and the Women's National Basketball Association, the WNBA, which is still around, but was created in 1997. So extremely young comparatively to other more professionalized leagues in the United States. We also have Olympic heroes, like in track and field, we have Florence Griffith Joyner, FloJo, as a lot of us kind of are familiar with her name that way, and her sister-in-law, Jackie Joyner Kersee. For gymnastics, we have Mary Lou Retton. Figure skating, we have Kristi Yamaguchi, but we also have professional heroes, and for basketball, Nancy Lieberman was one of the athletes that kind of unfortunately was caught in the crossfire of a lot of opening and closings of women's professional basketball leagues. But she was so good that she actually played in both men's and women's professional basketball leagues. In the times when women's leagues were available, she would play for them. But in the events that they were closed, then she would go and play for the G League professional NBA. And so they also had the Harlem Globetrotters and also illuminated gender and income disparity with her platform. For soccer, we have Mia Hamm, who was an All-American Olympian and professional soccer player, as well as just being a prominent leader in the dominance of the United States women's soccer team in the 1980s. 90s. This was also the time where we have Brandi Chastain. So there's a lot of different sports in which women have that presence, both domestically and internationally. For golf, we have Nancy Lopez, Latin American, Mexican American woman who not only won $4 million in the pro circuits, but is arguably one of the best golfers that we've ever had. In terms of amateur heroes, many women athletes would actually beat out men in a lot of co-ed amateur competitions like endurance swimming, Iditarod dog sledding, climbing, bowling, and endurance running. And so all of these things to say, people really had to reevaluate their perspectives of gender in this more modern space. Because of their dominance, spectators and sports writers really had to come to the idea around changing their ideas of gender, the idea that women are inherently feeble and weak. And so many women athletes were started to be evaluated by more on the masculine-feminine spectrum, where more masculine athletes were thought of as lesbians and more feminine athletes were thought of as sex objects. So even through this evaluation, they're still being explicitly objectified and stereotyped based on their adherence and participation in sport. And so all this to say that we still have a lot of work to be done because we're still kind of feeling those effects today. This was also a time, as I mentioned earlier, in which we started to see a lot of drug and body abuse. And so as I kind of go through a couple of examples of what happened specifically in the 1980s, 90s, I want you to think of the answer to this question. Is the drug problem getting worse, or do we just have better science and technology to make it and detect it? And so all this really starts in 1975, where athletic governments started to ban illicit PEDs. Drug use and illicit lifestyle isn't new to sport, right? We've seen many examples of that through this class, but they started to ban it. And so after the ban, it led to a lot more nuanced and masking of those who still wanted to use drugs, in which there's different examples of that in the following points. So in terms of substance abuse, various athletes at the time abused cocaine and or alcohol as means to either get an edge or cope with the stresses and pain of being a professional athlete. They often lost their jobs, and even some of them lost their lives. This led to a lot of investigative efforts to really assess the lifestyles of prospective athletes before drafting them or even signing them. An example, and I just wanted to double check, so an example of this that I wanted to kind of illuminate as a modern example of this kind of screening that a lot of these professional organizations do is an example that I think of very recently is Laremy Tunsil. So Laremy Tunsil plays for the NFL. But when he was a college player, he was projected to go top 5. Like, he was extremely talented, was going to go top 5 in the draft, which again, not only has notoriety benefits, but also generally athletes who get drafted earlier get better contracts. And so this does have financial implications. If you get drafted earlier to the NFL, you have a better chance of making more money. And so Laremy Tunsil was projected to be drafted within the top 5 that year of his draft. But it comes out just a couple days before the draft happens, there was a live stream video of Laremy with a gas mask that he kind of rigged to make it a hotbox machine. So he would like smoke weed with his gas mask. And that was a video that kind of circulated social media a couple days before the draft happened. And so because that happened, and because of the implications of these substance abuse kind of bannings, people were very hyper vigilant of these kind of risky athletes damaging the reputation of the sport, damaging the, moral developments of sport. His draft stock plummeted. I think he was still drafted the first round, but not nearly at the same level, notoriety, or really talent deservedly of where he eventually fell in that draft. And so this definitely still happens today, in which we talk about different athletes, again, being assessed by their risky behaviors and how that can impact the league in their investment of these athletes. We also have a lot of steroid use, in which many athletes took to using performance-enhancing drugs by either internal or external pressures to perform better. This resulted in the formation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, which I'm sure a lot of us are very familiar with, but also the USA Doping Agency, as well as NC2A monitoring their athletes using various methods like random drug tests. That still happens today. This was also a time in which we have a lot of rampant body dysmorphia, pain, and injury, in which both men who typically suffer from body dysmorphia more so than women, and then women who suffer from disordered eating behaviors more so than men, fallen victim to this period's perception of beauty standards, specifically within the sporting space. The idea that now spectators, fans, are objectifying athletes by what their bodies look like and not necessarily what they do in sports. And so for pain, a lot of athletes are kind of taught to push through bodily pain, right? That's something that a lot of us hear of in sport, push through, grit, mental toughness and all this stuff, the expectation of self-sacrifice in sport. And so with this kind of training, it unfortunately can cause a lot of increased injuries for these athletes because they're kind of taught to suppress these pain signals. And so if they play very high intensity or high physicality sports, this increases their chances of having career-ending injuries because they're not listening to their bodily signals. This also directly impacts people with body dysmorphia and disordered eating behaviors because they're kind of taught to push through pain, discomfort in order to adhere to a certain body standard. And so we see this in many different forms during this era. We also see in this era there are a lot of consequences to stardoms. The idea that a lot of star athletes indulge in very promiscuous lifestyles, from having a large paycheck, having nefarious sex with a bunch of different people. And so unfortunately, a lot of these choices and behaviors have real life consequences, in which Magic Johnson, as kind of one of the most iconic names of this era, contracted HIV, which at the time was an extremely villainized disease that not only did impact people, we didn't know much about it, but it was also very stigmatized because it was a very homophobic kind of disease. But Magic Johnson, being a straight man and contracting it, kind of dismantled a lot of the homophobia surrounding it. However, it was still extremely villainized at the era, in which you can see in back on board how villainized it truly was. This was also a time in which a lot of professional athletes fathered children from multiple women. And so the idea that, again, we can kind of look and think about now, like Tyreek Hill as being one of the famous examples, Adrian Peterson as being one of those examples. But really these high level athletes having promiscuous lifestyles with women and how that can impact them long term with child support and influence. We also kind of see that, again, in a similar vein to, is drug abuse getting worse, or are we just having better science and technology to detect it? Is violence getting worse? And does violence in sport create violence outside of sport? And so in this era, again, within the context of sport, we see increased hostility seen with a lot of different very popular sports like hockey, like football, like soccer, but not necessarily with other sports like swimming and gymnastics. And historically, as we've talked about in this class, fighting and violence not only establishes social clout, but also reaffirms masculinity within the sports. And so Brian Marchment, who played professional hockey, talked about hockey as, hey, it's a man's game. If you can't play, get out and play tennis. Acknowledging that if you can't be violent and if you can't take violence, then this isn't the right sport for you. And so with all these different examples, hockey in particular, hockey has a very unique sporting culture because violence in hockey is not only allowed, but encouraged. Because not only does it draw in spectators, but it also kind of serves as a sanctioned kind of ritualistic function. It also reaffirms this hyper-masculine idealism, as you see with Brian Marchment's quote, that we expect in these types of sports. Various instances have arisen within the sports where both athletes and spectators have actually been charged with assault and manslaughter for their behaviors in and off the ice. For football, the NFL faced many different instances of violence, murder charges, domestic violence, and more that really tainted the image of the organization. And so some of the famous examples during this era was the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995, the Ray Lewis murder charges in 1999, as well as the Jack Tatum being paralyzed by Darryl Stingley with a brutal hit in 1978. And so violence in these sports are almost expected, but not without the criticisms of why these things are expected in these sports overall. Boxing is different because comparatively to hockey and football, boxing, the entire point of the sport is to maim the other person so much that they cannot fight back. And so for boxing, the world of boxing experiences violence in many different forms, right? Not only for the context of the sport, but a lot of athletes go above and beyond what's necessary. In particular, as an example, we have Mike Tyson. So Mike Tyson had a 37-0 record, but he was indicted, but also got in trouble because he bit a competitor's ear partially off out of the ring. We also have Evander Holyfield, who is convicted of rape. And so all these different things to say is that this is very common in a lot of these sports. For other sports, they face their own respective issues of violence and besmirching of their respective leagues. This was a time that we had Tonya Harding's scandal, in which figure skating was kind of brought into the mainstream eye because Tonya Harding was implicated in being associated with a hit against her competitor, Nancy Kerrigan. We also have baseball with Roberto Alomar, Frank Tanada, and Pete Rose being indicted of their own instances of violence. For basketball, we have Kermit Washington, Dennis Rodman, Jason Williams, as well as Kobe Bryant. And so all these things to say as we reflect on, this drug and body abuse as well as violence in sport, I want us to reflect on if these things have gotten worse since this era that we're talking about, or if we're just more hyper aware and hyper vigilant of it because of these initiatives to make it safer, better for everyone involved. That being said, we still experience discrimination in the 20th century, right? This is the end of the 20th century, and there's different examples of this discrimination. The first are athletes with disability. This was a time that we see a lot of increased visibility and acceptance within sports. We have the Paralympics being very much accepted, and this is really for folks with physical disability. So we had the 1960 Summer Olympics and the 1976 Winter Olympics, but we also see the Special Olympics coming about right before this era, being created for folks with intellectual disability in 1968. This is also a time that was very marked by extreme homophobia, in which a lot of gay athletes experienced extreme discrimination and ostracization, death threats. But they also challenged these hyper-masculine ideals of sport. Although homophobia was still rampant, gay athletes like Greg Louganis, Billie Jean King, and Martina Navratilova were really pioneers in showcasing that sexuality shouldn't really matter in the lives of athletes or the general population. But this was a time of hyper homophobia and during the AIDS epidemic, HIV epidemic, and so that really directly, disproportionately impacted folks of the gay community. However, hypermasculine sports like football, like baseball, like basketball, and hockey really pressured gay male athletes into the closet until after their retirement and their distance from sports. As an example of this, David Kope in the NFL waited 5 years after his retirement to come out of the closet. John Amici was in the NBA. He faced blatant ostracism and demonization from his old teammates after his retirement. And so it kind of makes sense that there are so few queer athletes in these very hyper-masculine sporting spaces because a lot of homophobia still transcends in these hyper-masculine sports. In terms of racism, there is greater growing acceptance of multiracial athletes, but long-standing white supremacist values, as we've seen throughout the history of this class, still lingers in many different ways. People in power often indulge in lingering racist practices by calling their players names, calling them names using racial slurs, stacking athletes into certain positions, as well as perpetuating problematic eugenic research, really attempting to determine the supremacy of certain races. Particularly with Black athletes and African American athletes, there's still a lot of pseudoscience that attempted to isolate Blackness as an attributing factor to why African Americans have been so historically dominant in sport. But as we've talked about in this class, that's not really true. We find that we ought to really look more at the social opportunities provided to Black athletes through this lens of historical and systemic oppression, as well as acknowledging pigeonholing of young Black children into certain sports for this dream of equality within America, the idea of upward social mobility, right? These rags to riches stories that we find very often, particularly targeted towards Black and African American communities and other athletes of color. For Native American athletes, they did face obviously a lot of inequality in and out of sports, but sports did take a step in the right direction with the NC2A banning all collegiate mascots with Native American names, images, or caricatures, and we are starting to now see it in this space with professional and local sports. There are some examples today of still using Native American athletes or names as well as images, but that they had to get explicit permission from these local communities in order to do so. So again, although we do see a step in the right direction, we still see that kind of stereotypical caricature representation in other sporting spaces. Then we start to see the development of a new kind of appraisal for sport icons, as well as the development of alternative sports. And so for this duality of athletes, I really kind of want this to be a conversation about this new shift from more team-oriented sport to individualism that, again, caused a lot of fans who once saw themselves within the athletes and professionalism to feel detached and unfortunately weakened a lot of their loyalties. And so because of this, we started to see, again, that loss of fandom, that people didn't really identify with the athletes that they at one point did. They were no longer working class. They were no longer, these rags to riches stories. And so they were multimillionaires, which is something that not a lot of middle class Americans can really relate to, especially within the sporting space. Some athletes did embrace this individualism, the idea that they were able to have commercial gain, as well as the flash and kind of notoriety associated with individualism. Michael Jordan being one of those individuals, Neon Deion Sanders, who at the time was a multi-sport athlete, now is a coach for Colorado State, as well as Sugar Ray Leonard, who was a boxing icon during this era. But some stars still resurged popularity with the sport by kind of returning back to more traditionalist perspectives of athletes. They did so with talent, attitude, and humility, in which some examples from this era in particular, Wayne Gretzky. Wayne Gretzky, arguably one of the best hockey athletes ever, but he really kind of resurged popularity for the sport because he was very humble with kind of how he approached sport, in a contrast with a lot of the athletes that embrace this individualism. Another example is Lou Gehrig for baseball, Walter Payton for football, as well as Bo Jackson, who played football and baseball. And so, all of this to say is that there's this kind of interesting, dichotomy of athletes, that a lot of athletes really like this idea of sport being very commercialized, having a lot of money to be had, a lot of fame, a lot of notoriety, but other athletes embrace this more traditional element of sport, of it being kind of a moral space to develop, a space to showcase talent, communication, teamwork. And so there are two kind of ends to that spectrum, right? And most professional athletes today exist on one, within that spectrum of individualism versus team orientation. But we still find fandoms exist on that spectrum regardless. This is also, as we wrap up, the era in which we start to see a lot more of acceptance and alternative in extreme sports. So to kind of give you some examples of what that looks like, this could be BMX, inline skating, rock climbing, skateboarding, kayaking, snowboarding, skydiving, and other things that are kind of more alternative. And these very much grew in popularity because it gave young people a change of pace, still with an opportunity to satiate this quest for self-fulfillment. They also were relatively rebellious in this identification. They didn't really like the idea of sport being very traditionalist. They wanted it to be something different. They also wanted to search for peak experiences, what we kind of consider adrenaline rushes. And so this brought more popularity to rural areas with lots of space and natural playgrounds, like parks, like national parks, and like snowboarding, skiing areas. But as we do, we couldn't let it just be what it is, because again, kind of the whole point of alternative sport is to be a countercurrent to mainstream sport, which is extremely commercialized, extremely competitive, very violent, very, nefarious in a lot of its behaviors. Alternative sport was the alternative to that. They wanted it to be active, they wanted it to be fun, but they didn't want to be embraced by this commercialized kind of outlook of sport. Unfortunately, the mechanism of American capitalism still found its way to extreme sports. And so commercialization still happened, in which companies actually took to capitalizing on this new wave of sport participation by creating clothing brands, clothing merchandise that really emphasized non-mainstream imagery. Organizations would hold tournaments with cash prizes like we have with the X Games. And the Olympics eventually started to integrate certain extreme sports into their programs in order to commercialize it, mainstream it, and have more acceptance. And so even though it was literally created to kind of counteract these less desirable effects of current mainstream sports, unfortunately, it still succumbed to the powerhouse of commercialization and capitalist idealisms that happen within the American sporting space. And so during these 20 years, a lot of things happened. So do kind of remember that this is considered the globalized era of sport. We talked about the 1984 Summer Olympics in terms of pseudo warfare, commercialization, and amateurism. So do kind of take note of why LA in particular was very transformational in how we kind of approach the Olympics today. This was also a time in which we saw the growth of baseball and basketball, noting significant athletes like Michael Jordan and those reasons for growth. This was also a time that was marked by a lot of drug and body abuse, so substance abuse, steroid abuse, body dysmorphia, disordered eating, lifestyle concerns, as well as health epidemics of the era. Understanding that discrimination was still extremely rampant for many different communities in terms of disability, we have an increased access but not true acceptance. Homophobia with the AIDS epidemic really made for a particularly hostile time for the queer community, in particular queer athletes, as well as racism, acknowledging that this was a time that a lot of scientists still tried to isolate Blackness as a differentiating factor for performance when they should have just acknowledged the historical and sociological implications of this particular group. And then the rise of alternative sports, so the reasons for popularity, but also acknowledging the commercial exploitation of folks wanting to take advantage of this new popular sport. So let me know if you have any questions about this week. Next week, we're going to be finishing up our textbook. So we're talking about from 2000 to 2015. So please read chapter 11 and Edson 27. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you then.